being here. Take it
Yeah,
away, Sarah.
awesome. Thanks, Geneva. So hi guys, I'm Sarah. Like I said, I'm one of the project leaders on this. So I just want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for taking your time to be here on this Saturday morning for our 5th session in this virtual climate change boot camp. Just to remind you that this session is policy is key, current policy measures that could impact climate change. In case this is your first time volunteering with us, LA Works is a nonprofit volunteer action center that creates and implements hands-on community service projects throughout the greater Los Angeles area. We strive to empower Angelenos to address pressing social issues through volunteerism and community collaborations. And that brings us to our expert speaker today, Bill Magavern. He is the policy director at Coalition for Clean Air, and he has more than 25 years experience advocating for environmental and public interest causes. So just a quick overview of today's schedule. Bill will give us kind of a mini presentation, then we'll have a Q&A session, and then following that, we'll learn an advocacy skill that I and Bill will lead together. And then today's skill is learning how to write an op-ed. And then I just want everyone to remember that these are really treated as an open discussion, so turn on your cameras if you'd like, be eager, and participate. So again, I just want to thank everyone for taking your time out of your Saturday morning to learn about this extremely poignant issue of climate change and an advocacy skill we can use to affect change. So with that being said, take it away, Bill.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Good to be with you this morning, and I really just want to give props to all of you for taking time on a Saturday to learn about policies and skills related to climate change, because it's going to take a lot of effort from all of us to address this crisis. And it's really, ultimately, it's people power that changes history. So the fact that there is a climate change boot camp alone is encouraging to me. A little bit about the Coalition for Clean Air. We are actually headquartered in Los Angeles. As policy director, I'm based in Sacramento. And our mission is to restore clean air to California, prevent climate change, and protect public health. So we're a California nonprofit. We work at the state, regional, and local levels, occasionally address the national level, but mostly leave that to the groups that are organized nationally. And I'm going to talk about some of the policies that we need to address climate change. And if you look at where the emissions are coming from, the biggest source is transportation. In California, the Air Resources Board says that transportation accounts for roughly half of our greenhouse gas emissions. That's if you include the upstream emissions. So the emissions coming from transportation itself are about 40%. But then if you look at what it takes to produce and distribute transportation fuels, which is mostly petroleum, and all the oil drilling and refining we do in California, that adds another 10%. And it's important to look at what we call the full life cycle of emissions. So I like to use that 50% figure. If you look at the national level, transportation is less than half, but it still is the biggest single source of emissions. And in California, where we've had a fair amount of success, not enough, but a fair amount of success in cleaning up the electricity sector, we actually have not done as well when it comes to transportation. So most of my work is devoted to cleaning up the transportation system and reducing the emissions that we're generating. And there's a lot we need to do to clean up transportation. We sometimes talk about the 3 legs of the stool: cleaning up the engines and the fuels that are used to fuel the vehicles, and then also just reforming our transportation system as a whole so that we're reducing the miles that our vehicles travel. And that means finding other ways to get around besides just one person jumping in a car. We need more carpooling and van pooling, better public transit, more safe and convenient options for biking and walking around our communities. And that also means changing our land use patterns so that it's possible to get to where we want to go with a bike or a walk or a bus ride or a train ride. And this is not something we've been very good at in California. Something we have been better at, actually, and we lead the country in, is cleaning up the engines. And California has been setting clean car standards for decades. And in 2002, that was expanded to address the emissions that cause climate change. So, and that was actually a bill that I worked on, went through the legislature, was signed by the governor at the time, and then was implemented by the agency we have called the California Air Resources Board. So they took the law that was given to them and they actually set what are the standards for greenhouse gases that can come out of the car, which is mostly what comes out of the tailpipe. They also address some other systems like air conditioning, also leaks greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But it's primarily if we burn less fuel, gasoline or diesel, in the car, then less of that greenhouse gas pollution will come out of the tailpipe. So we have standards to do that. Those are now under attack by the Trump administration, like just about every other environmental standard. And California also became the first state in the country to have a standard requiring zero emission vehicles. So these are electric cars, either battery electric or fuel cell electric, that generate no emissions at all from the tailpipe. Now, as I talked about earlier, we look at life cycle emissions. So if you're plugging in your car, there are emissions associated with the electricity that is being generated to charge that car. And so we need to make that electricity as clean as possible. And I'll be talking about that. Or if it's a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, and there are fewer of those, but there are actually over 7,000 on the road in California, then we want that hydrogen to be generated in as clean a way as possible. And we need to electrify not only cars, but heavier vehicles like buses and trucks. And in fact, those are especially important because they usually run not on gasoline, but on diesel, which also comes from petroleum, but is even more polluting to the air than gasoline is. Not from a climate perspective, but from a clean air perspective, the air pollution that makes us sick, diesel is a toxic air contaminant. So as I mentioned, in California, we have a zero emission vehicle standard, although the Trump administration is trying to take that away. And that right now goes through 2025. We're needing now to ramp that up in a big way. So we're working with the Air Resources Board on increasing that standard after 2025. And people like me think that by the time we get to 2035, it should be 100%. So that would mean that every new vehicle sold in California would be a zero emission vehicle. So you could see what kind of transition that would be and how much work that's going to have to take to get us there. But the good news is there are a lot of good electric vehicles being sold now. They're not all expensive luxury cars. And as the prices of batteries come down, there are a lot of experts that think in the next 3 or 4 years, the electric vehicles will be no more expensive than the internal combustion engines. And we hit that tipping point and people have a chance to drive these cars. They're a lot of fun to drive. My wife and I share an electric vehicle. We have for about 7 years now. And the driving experience is excellent and they're quiet and you don't have to go to a gas station. The fuel is also actually cheaper than using gasoline. So it's very appealing and we need to continue spreading those. What's even harder is to electrify our trucks because they're bigger and heavier and the trucking industry tends to be very cautious. But there was a rule passed by the Air Resources Board just 2 months ago that I worked on with a lot of other folks for years. And that will be the first zero emission truck standard in the whole country. It's called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. And it tells the manufacturers that in upcoming years, starting in 2024, certain percentages of the trucks they sell in California will have to be zero emission. And California has a unique role under the US Clean Air Act, which may be the most important and successful environmental law ever passed in this country. The federal government, the US EPA, is in charge of setting emission standards for what we call mobile sources of pollution, the ones that move around, like cars, trucks, trains, buses, even smaller pieces of equipment like lawnmowers. But California is the only state that has the ability to set its own standards if they are stronger than the national standards. And then other states have a choice. They can follow the weaker national standard or opt into the California standard. And we've got now about a dozen other states that are choosing the California car standards. And this, again, this is something that the Trump administration hates, so that's being fought out in court right now. That litigation will not be decided before the election, so this could all be moot if Trump is kicked out of office and we get a more enlightened administration in Washington that would actually work with California and help us on this instead of hurting us. So we need not only to go all zero emission with our cars, but before we get to that point, 2035, we need to clean up the internal combustion engines so that we keep getting to a point where those are emitting fewer and fewer greenhouse gases. And that will mean they'll also go further on a gallon of gas. So their fuel efficiency will be better, and that saves consumers money at the pump. So it's very popular actually with everybody except for the oil industry and some of the auto companies. And that's who Trump listens to. As I mentioned, as we clean up the cars by having them run on electricity, that means we need to clean up our electricity system. And here again, California has really been setting the pace. We were the first state to have what's called a renewables portfolio standard. And that tells the utilities who sell electricity to us that they have to have increasing percentages of that electricity come from clean renewable resources like solar and wind and geothermal. And we're now in California, I think we're at roughly about 36% of our electricity is coming from those resources. And that does not count the hydropower that comes from large dams, which is another 10% or so. Our law says that by 2026, we need to be at 50% clean energy. By 2030, we need to be at 60%. And then by 2045, there's a goal, 100% carbon-free resources. A number of other states also have this kind of clean energy standard. In fact, some even have gone beyond California. And there's a lot of talk now at the national level. If the elections go well, the Congress might pass a national clean energy standard. And that's important not only because it's that clean electricity that we need to fuel our cars, but power plants are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The second biggest source after transportation is power plants. And so nationally, we still have a lot of electricity coming from coal, which is highly polluting. In California, we have very little coal at this point, but we still use a lot of natural gas. And natural gas, although it's cleaner than coal, is also a greenhouse gas. It's methane. When you burn it, it generates carbon dioxide. If you don't burn it and it escapes into the atmosphere, it's actually a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we need to get methane out of the system and replace that natural gas with clean renewable energy. Now, as you probably know, we had a couple blackouts this past weekend in California. I actually experienced one of them because I happened to be in Santa Cruz. And some of the fossil fuel industry are trying to say that the reason we had those blackouts is because California has clean energy laws. Nothing could be further from the truth. The solar energy in California was doing exactly what it was supposed to do last weekend. The problem was that one or more of the gas-fired power plants went down. It may have been because it was so hot. So you have heat that's caused by climate change. And then you have a gas-fired plant, which contributes to climate change, going off the grid. And yet somehow the industry wants us to believe that gas is the answer and solar is the problem. So that is far from true. We need to get out of gas. We need more renewables. Now, it is true that we need to improve our electricity system so that when the sun goes down, we can still take advantage of clean energy. And there are ways to do that by storing that energy with batteries or other means, and also by using some round-the-clock renewables like geothermal or solar thermal. So we're not just relying on solar photovoltaic panels. So the state does need to adjust to that, but it doesn't mean abandoning clean energy. When we talk about climate change, it's also very important that we always talk about climate justice. And that's because climate change and air pollution do not affect all of us equally. It has been documented many times that it's low-income communities of color that are hit first and worst by climate change. They're in areas that have the fewest resources with which to address the problem, have the least adequate health care, and are usually the closest to the polluting facilities, like the refineries or the power plants or the toxic waste dumps. In fact, it is race that is the biggest single predictor of whether people will be living near polluting facilities. And that's why in this country we have an environmental justice movement, which I think is particularly strong in California. And I'm proud to say that the Coalition for Clean Air, we had an idea that we got passed into law, which says that when California brings in revenues from our climate change program, from auctioning off pollution allowances, that a large chunk of that money has to go into the disadvantaged communities that have suffered the worst from the environmental injustices of the past. And that means investments in things like rooftop solar and making homes more energy efficient, and urban parks and urban greening and clean mobility for everyone. So it's crucial that we continue to make those investments in our disadvantaged communities. And that, I think, is also a model that we can give to the rest of the country. And fortunately, the national conversation, among those who actually want to do something about climate change, is now more centered than it has been in the past on justice. The environmental justice movement is being listened to more than in the past. And it, of course, is intertwined with social justice and anti-racism and anti-poverty. So it's important to recognize that those movements are connected and that we cannot have an adequate response to the climate crisis without also addressing historical injustices. So in California, if you are in Wilmington, you are suffering from pollution coming from the huge port of Los Angeles, which brings in polluting ships and then puts goods on polluting trucks or locomotives. And you're also getting the pollution from nearby oil refineries. And yet, if you go up the coast to Malibu, you're going to find much cleaner air, not far away. And we have the same thing across the state. There are communities in the San Joaquin Valley that are breathing some of the most polluted air in the nation. They've got oil drilling going on. They've got massive dairy farms. They've got factory agriculture that's been allowed to go unchecked. They often can't get clean drinking water out of their taps, which most of us are able to take for granted in this society. So there still are massive environmental injustices that need to be corrected. want to talk a little bit about ways that people can get involved. We'll be talking about op-eds, which is a great way to make your voice heard. You also can be in direct contact with your elected officials, whether that be members of Congress, local city council members, or county supervisors. And unfortunately, a lot of people tend to often skip over their state legislators. And that's at the level where I do most of my work, and where most of California's success has happened has been at the level of the state government. And what I have found is that, in the Capitol, and I'm sitting right now in my office in downtown Sacramento, just a few blocks from the state Capitol, where, when there's not a coronavirus rampant, I've spent a lot of time there over the years in the halls and talking to the legislators. And we've been able to get strong environmental legislation, and including the best climate laws in the country, passed there when we had a lot of people behind them. But when there are not a lot of people looking, then some of the legislators are going to side with their big campaign contributors, who very much include the oil industry and the gas industry and big chemical companies and a whole range of special interests that are always there. They have the money, they have the connections, and for us to beat them really takes a lot of activism. So that means, again, in pre-COVID times, people would sometimes come to the Capitol to make their voices heard here. And actually now when they have hearings, you can phone in, so you don't even need to leave your home. But you don't even need to come here. You can write letters. You can go to the district offices of your legislators. They don't get a lot of people coming to their district offices. If 5 of you showed up there, that would make a difference. You can also be public in your advocacy through traditional media. We'll be talking about op-eds, through social media, which of course now is how a lot of people get their information, through peaceful protest. So there are a lot of ways, if you look at the history of social change in this country, that movements have been able to get people in power to change. And that's the history of the environmental movement. If you look at the first wave of great environmental laws in this country, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, they followed the first Earth Day in 1970. And even though the president at that time, Richard Nixon, he didn't care about the environment, but he was forced to sign these laws because it was so popular. And that's what people can do if enough of us get organized and get active. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Magavern. Like I said before, this is really an open discussion. So anyone, you can either write your questions in the chat, just unmute yourself and blurt in, whatever.
I'll start with some questions. I have a question about the regulations on battery production, because if we're trying to create more batteries and more accessible batteries, how are we looking at production and disposal of those batteries?
Thanks, that's a really good question. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier of looking at the life cycle. So yeah, if we're looking at vehicles, we need to look at what's fueling them. So right now, internal combustion engines have lead acid batteries in them. Lead is one of the substances most toxic to humans. And if it gets into the atmosphere, it gets into the water, even a little bit of it is neurologically damaging. It's been demonstrated to cause a loss of IQ points. And actually there are studies that have tied high lead levels to higher levels of crime. Battery recycling of lead batteries has led to massive pollution in Los Angeles. There's a battery recycling plant called Exide that has spread pollution around mostly Latino working class communities like Vernon and East Los Angeles. And that cleanup is still going on. If we look at batteries for electric vehicles, there also are some heavy metals in those and some rare earth metals. So far, the industry is so new that we haven't seen a lot of battery recycling. Really what could be the best solution is when a battery is at the end of its life in your car, it could still be used in a stationary source. So, for example, could be attached to your household, and you could store electricity so that in a case of a blackout, you would have some backup power. But we also do need to have adequate recycling facilities, and we need to look at sources for the metals that come in batteries that are as little polluting as possible, because they do come from mining, and also that don't involve human rights violations, because some of these metals are coming from countries with abysmal human rights records. The question was about the regulations, and at this point, I would say the regulations are still in an early stage, and I know that the regulators in California are starting to look at this, both at the Air Resources Board and also at Cal Recycle, which is in charge of recycling and end-of-life disposal of our materials.
Thank you. We've got a question from Becca and Dara in the chat. What do you suggest is the best way to recycle the batteries?
Yeah, well, that's I did see that. That's what I was trying to address by suggesting that reuse. We have the hierarchy: reduce, reuse, recycle.
Right.
So reusing is even better than recycling. So if we can put the batteries to use out of a car, but in a stationary situation to help power a building, I think that would actually be the best way.
If anybody else has any questions, jump in. Yeah.
What about what are you doing to encourage people to take other forms of transport? I mean, realistically, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, and that's something that's close to my heart because I'm a bicycle commuter. I've been riding my bike to my office for about 20 years. And it's an area where I think actually, young people are way ahead of the rest of society because it's been, at least at this point, it's looking like millennials are not as attached to car ownership as older people are. So first of all, we need much more convenient and accessible and affordable public transit. If you've had the opportunity to visit other countries, you've probably seen that they tend to have much more developed transit systems. If you're looking at the train systems in Europe, I had a chance to go to China last year and rode the high-speed rail there from Guangzhou to Beijing. It was a great experience and only took 8 hours to cover about 1,400 miles. So public transit, investing in that, including rail, is one option. Another is just making sure that our streets are safe for humans. We shouldn't be building our streets for the convenience of a motor vehicle. City streets should be places where people can safely walk and bike. And I mean, this country's been terrible about that. I've seen some improvements. Like actually right outside my office, we have what are called parking protected bike lanes. So there's a row of parked cars in between me and the traffic as I'm biking down the street. But we only have a handful of these in the whole city of Sacramento. So there needs to be a lot more of that. Yeah, and someone's put in the chat, they're doing that in Santa Monica which is great. And Santa Monica has been a leader in a lot of these areas. And then land use is a big problem because we've often tended to have a pattern in this country of putting our housing way out on the fringes of our urban areas and not putting the jobs or the schools in those areas so that people are feeling like they have to jump in a car wherever they're going. And you know, that's the way the suburbs were built traditionally in this country. And we need to focus more of our investment in the already built urban areas. And a lot of those areas can use the investment because if you look at, say, an old strip mall with stores that nobody goes to anymore, let's redevelop that into housing. And you know, there need to be other forms of housing besides the sort of standard American single family home with a yard. There are a lot of people who are happy and could be happy living in attached housing or apartments. Again, if you go to other countries, you're much more likely to see buildings that go up a lot higher. And you know, I hear politicians try to demonize that as if it's somehow un-American or something, but it's really not such a bad way to live, to be able to walk out your front door and be able to walk to work or to school or to the coffee shop or the theater, or be able to see your friends without having to get into a car. It's also a lot safer if you look at the tens of thousands of people who die in car accidents every year. It's a tough one to crack though, because the development happens over a long period of time and there is a lot of resistance. So it's going to take a lot of political will to change that.
I have a question. I mean, so we come from New York City where that's public transportation was everything. You know, you could just, she lived on the east side, I lived on the west, could just jump on a subway or a bus. And in LA, it's so different. Is that even a possibility that they would restructure everything, or does that just cost too much money? Or where does the resistance for restructuring the city and urban planning come from?
Yeah, good question. And I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, and I've spent a lot of time in New York City also, which I love. I mean, LA has made some improvements. I mean, of course, historically, it was going in the wrong direction. There actually was a good streetcar system, which was torn down in, I think, the 40s. And everything was built around the car. And then the smog got so bad that people couldn't breathe or see the mountains. And there's been progress made against the smog, but it's still the worst in the whole country, and it's still unhealthy. The voters in LA have actually voted to invest a lot of money into public transit. So, you know, as that builds out, we will see improvements. But one of the problems is simply governance. If you look at the LA region, you know, you've got the city of Los Angeles is big, but then you've got all these other cities. And even, you know, it's a metropolitan region that even goes beyond LA County. You got Orange County and San Bernardino and Riverside, and they all come together sort of in something called the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG. And so SCAG has these plans to try to reduce emissions by reducing vehicle miles traveled. But the individual cities and counties, they don't have to abide by that. You know, SCAG isn't like a super government. And that sort of local authority is jealously guarded in California. And, you know, sometimes for good reason. It can be really good to have your government be as close to the people as possible. But it's really hard to do good planning when, you know, you cross over from one jurisdiction into another and you've got completely different governance. In the Bay Area, there's something like 27 different transit agencies. So that also makes it more difficult to have regional transit. So yeah, there is a lot of resistance, and the way to overcome it really is just political will. If people demand it, then the leaders will have to change.
I'm interested in piggybacking off of that question too, because I asked a similar one in the chat earlier about, because Los Angeles was built by the oil companies for cars to be the main thing. And I know that Caltrans is trying to make some changes toward converting to clean energy. So how does that look for like Metro and Caltrans and the current people that are, you know, using these public transportation vehicles to be more?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, Caltrans was part of the problem.
Yeah.
And their whole goal was really to build more capacity on roads, freeways and surface roads. And they thought they were doing a good job if the vehicles would move more quickly. And they really didn't care about what that meant was being put into our air, or, you know, what it was doing to the livability of the cities. So it was considered a success in this country when people had ways to go from the suburbs to the city and then, you know, back home again at night without ever, you know, really interacting with any of the people along the way. We have seen change at the top at Caltrans. The new director really understands the importance of reform. Whether that filters all the way down, I think still remains to be seen. They did recently make a very sort of wonky but important change, which is that when new development projects are analyzed, it used to be that it was considered favorable if they improved what's called level of service. And level of service is what I was talking about. It's how quickly the cars are moving. Now that has been changed, and what will be favored is reducing miles traveled by vehicles. So if somebody's proposing an infill project in an already built urban area, and they want to put in, say, a mid-rise 5-story apartment building, you might get a few more cars on the road, so the level of service might slow down a little. But now we'd be saying that's okay because the people will be living there nearer to the urban core, not out in the suburbs where they'd actually be doing a lot more driving. This had a huge amount of resistance, and we had to fight back attempts to overturn it, but it has gone into effect. So that's the kind of change made in government that doesn't get much attention publicly, but could ultimately make a lot of difference.
So how do we push for more of those changes to happen?
I think a lot of that is getting your local officials. A lot of development is controlled by counties and cities. So by basically storming the county halls and city halls and demanding bikeable, walkable communities, because unfortunately, a lot of those making the loudest noise have been on the other side. There have been parts of Los Angeles, and actually around UCLA is one of them, where when the city tried to put in bike lanes, the people who were the loudest were the ones who said, no, you're taking away car lanes. I want to be able to drive faster there. And the council member who represents the area, Paul Koretz, who I knew him when he was in the state assembly. And, you know, he would tell you that he's as green as they come. He would introduce recycling bills and that kind of thing. But he was against those bike lanes. So, you know, we need to have more activism on the side of those who want the safe and convenient biking and not to have the streets be built for the convenience of cars. A specific protest versus a specific oil or gas company is a question in the chat. Yeah, I'm in favor of that. It's what you call a target-rich environment because there's so many bad oil companies. You know, Chevron is really influential in California because they're a California company and they got a lot of business here. They got a lot of lobbyists here. So I'm going to put them at or near the top of the list. There's also Texas companies, Valero and Tesoro, who they actually tried to block our global warming law. Back in 2010, they put a measure on the ballot to do that. So those are some of the worst of the companies that are selling petroleum in California. Now, here's a question that I was sort of expecting. Do you think that COVID's effect on our confidence with working remote and noticing benefits with air quality and quality of life without traffic may help shift the public opinion on walkable streets versus faster traffic lanes? I sure hope so. I mean, one of the best responses that we have seen to COVID was during the early days of the shutdown, when people really weren't driving and they were getting out and walking, because you got to get outside of your house sometime, right? Or biking. And in some of the metropolitan areas, finding there wasn't enough room on the street. So there have been some experiments with basically repurposing streets so that they can be walking corridors and biking corridors and closing them off to vehicle traffic. That was done in San Francisco with part of Market Street even before COVID, and done, I know, with at least somewhere in Oakland. And I know there's a movement in LA that we've supported to do that also. And it's happened in New York too. So that, I think, could have a lasting effect. I just saw that yesterday in Burbank, so that restaurants could seat people. Yeah, exactly. Since we can't go inside to the restaurants, and you know, in California, the weather, at least when it's not smoky, you want to be outside. You can eat outside. So the restaurants are going out onto the streets, which is great as long as you don't have to eat like 3 feet from cars that are whizzing by, right? So you need to really keep the traffic away. Good to see people in the chat saying it's happening in Santa Monica and around LA. So that's an excellent development. One of the much more negative results from COVID is a lot of people are afraid to go on transit. And I honestly don't blame them. It's an enclosed place. So we're seeing a lot of decreases, and it's really hurting the transit agencies. And I think we don't know yet how safe it is to be on the bus or the train, because I'm seeing reports that there actually have been very few documented cases of transmission on buses or trains. And so I hope that is the case. There are countries like Hong Kong where people are mostly taking public transit that have very low rates of transmission. So it would be great if we could keep public transit safe. And the remote working is something that, even though in pre-COVID times, one of the things I really like about my job is doing it in person. And, like I said, I ride my bike to work and then usually would walk to the Capitol or the Cal EPA building and see people and do business that way. So I don't like having to do it all by, Zoom and phone. But I also see in my world that people have been much too ready to jump on an airplane. Lots of people will take a plane from Sacramento to LA or vice versa to go to one meeting. And I think that's so wasteful. And so I'm hoping that a lot of those trips do get replaced by Zoom and other teleconferencing options. And I'm fairly hopeful about that. All right, question on the chat. What can we do to protect low-income people and people of color who tend to have less political clout from the gentrification and displacement that coincides with new developments? Yeah, very appropriate question, and it's difficult. There are a lot of good people working on this, though. Groups that I work with, like Policy Link and the Green Lining Institute. I mean, one way is to make sure that the people that are already living in a neighborhood do have a voice when it comes to new development. And it's tricky because what we've seen is that privileged people often use that voice to keep out affordable housing and even to keep out public transit. because, you know, they're afraid. So we don't want to empower those folks, but we do want to empower the low-income communities of color to help shape development in their neighborhoods so they get the needed investment, but without being displaced. And that's tricky, no question about it. So I think we need to get real guidelines put in that, for example, would prevent housing that we have that's adequate from being demolished, as well as having rent control, so that as a neighborhood is considered more desirable, that the people who are already living there can still afford to live there. How do we address gentrification and pushing people out of homes to build more sustainable, affordable rental housing in legislation pushing for more environmentally friendly living circumstances? And that's something that's been discussed in the California legislature a lot the last couple of years, because there's been legislation by Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, and he's probably the most pro-transit legislator that we have. So he's saying, let's build around transit. But to do that, he's saying, let's relax the zoning restrictions for redevelopment around transit. And some of the equity groups have said, well, no, then we're afraid we're going to get luxury apartment buildings and it'll push out the people living there. So because of that, Senator Wiener did put a lot more protections into his bill, like against demolition, and really was trying to protect against displacement and gentrification, which I think was enough for some people and not enough for others. So between that criticism and the people in the suburbs who wanted to protect sprawl development, his bill has not been able to move forward so far. But that dialogue will definitely continue. And that seems to be what our federal government is pushing for. Absolutely. I mean, Trump has been really blatant about this. He said something, he relaxed the Obama administration's guidelines for building affordable housing. And he was very blatant in saying, you know, suburbanites, you don't need to worry about having affordable housing. So, you know, that's basically racist. And he's hoping that, you know, there are enough racists in the suburbs who agree with him. My hunch is there are not, but yeah, we need a huge change at the federal level. Is there a leader amongst auto companies shifting to electric, or which ones have been most resistant to the shift? Well, of course, the leading electric vehicle company in this country is Tesla, which is an all-electric company and is the biggest seller of electric cars in this country. In fact, in the first quarter of this year, the Tesla Model 3 was the most popular selling car in California. But I think the question may have been about the traditional auto companies who've been making internal combustion engines, and which among them is the best at shifting to electric. And it's kind of a tough question to answer. The first one that came out with an electric car was Nissan with the Leaf. And then they were followed by Chevrolet, which put out the plug-in hybrid Volt, and then the all-electric Bolt. And that's Chevrolet is a General Motors company, of course. But more recently, at the policy level, I talked about how the Trump administration is attacking California's clean car standards. So the auto companies had to make a choice. And some of them sided with Trump, and some of them sided with California. So those siding with Trump included General Motors, Toyota, Nissan, and Fiat Chrysler. Those siding with California, there were 5 of them: Ford, Honda, Volkswagen, BMW, and Volvo. So Ford, even though they don't have a lot of great electric cars out there now, they have some. They're planning to really bank on electric cars in the future. and they sided with California. Volkswagen's an interesting case because they were the worst. They were pushing diesel cars, and they cheated on the emissions testing, as you probably heard. This was a massive criminal conspiracy. They were caught by some nonprofit groups and the state of California, and they've had to pay massive penalties, which the state is putting into clean vehicles. And there have been criminal prosecutions of at least some of their executives, which I think is really important, that when there are massive environmental crimes, there should be criminal prosecutions of the executives. The good thing is Volkswagen is doing a big turnaround. They're going away from diesel, and they're planning to go electric. And as I said, they sided with the state of California. So, you know, I'm not going to say they've redeemed themselves yet from their crime, but I would say that we've been successful in getting them to do a turnaround. There also are some other startup companies making electric-only vehicles. And I want to point out that it's not just cars, but we have companies that are making electric buses, including here in California. There's a company called BYD, which is a Chinese company, stands for Build Your Dreams. They are, I think, the biggest seller of electric vehicles in China. If you go to China, you'll see their electric cars. A lot of the taxis are BYD electric cars. In this country, they're not selling cars, but they are selling electric buses, including to LA Metro. And there's an American company called Proterra, which is making cars in the City of Industry. And they're headquartered in Burlingame in the Bay Area, making buses. Proterra makes electric buses. And both these companies also are getting into trucks. And there are other companies making electric trucks also, including making them in California. Great questions, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, super great questions. Okay, so Geneva has one more question on carbon capture, and then I think after that one, we'll go on to the advocacy scale.
Yeah, carbon capture is one of those areas where I haven't worked a lot on it, to tell you the truth. I'm always a little skeptical when it comes up because it often is being pushed by the fossil fuel interests. Like the oil or coal companies will say, well, we can keep burning our fuel. We'll just capture all the carbon and sequester it, so we'll be carbon neutral. And so far, it has not been demonstrated that they can do that. However, I do think that, you know, we do need to, first of all, stop burning coal and oil and gas. But the crisis is so bad that we do need to actually take some of that carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there. So at this point, I would say that we should be pushing the research and development on carbon capture at the same time as we're fending off the fossil fuel companies who are trying to basically use it for greenwashing. And we need to keep the focus on reducing emissions as much as possible and getting away from fossil fuels.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yeah, we had one of our previous sessions touched a lot on carbon capture as well. And we thought, in the end, I think we all agreed the same thing, how it is necessary in such a crisis, but it needs to be combined with reducing emissions, not just encouraging to capture it. Okay, so thank you everyone for all the really good questions. I'm gonna share my screen and then we're gonna go into the advocacy skill. Share. Okay, so let's see, present. Let's see if I can put everyone's faces on top so I can see people. All right, everyone can see this, right? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna start, and then Bill has actually written an op-ed before, so he's going to give some pointers afterwards in addition. So today's is how to write and send an op-ed. How do you switch? Okay, so first, like a lot of people might not know what an op-ed is. So it's actually like the name is kind of old for when papers were more printed, and it means opposite the editorial. And so an editorial is like a piece by the actual newspaper or magazine expressing their opinions. And then the op-ed is opposite of it, and it's usually by someone that's not associated with the news outlet at all, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the opinion of the paper or print. It might as well be the exact opposite of what they think. And it can be a wide range of subjects. So it could be from like climate change to education to politics, like literally anything they find interesting. And op-ed authors vary. It can include people who have never written for like a publication before or rarely. So like obviously a lot of us volunteers fall under that. And then others are better known people such as novelists, historians, policymakers, humorists, activists. And I'll share this slide with people right after, but this is a link to the LA Times article literally explaining what it is if people want to look more in depth to it. So the next thing is, why are they important and what can they do? Well, I think op-eds are really cool because they're they're telling the stories of people who aren't involved with the paper and just of firsthand experience with, but also with arguments and calls to action often. So when something's really well written and published, they can actually make a real impact. They offer an opportunity to educate and inform a large audience about an issue that's important to you, your organization, or your constituents. So it could be used to even call out policymakers, or say like the governor or your state legislators, kind of similar to how like a letter to your elected official would work. It could ultimately sway their attitudes or their opinions, because obviously in an ideal democracy, you voted for them to represent your ideas and values. So they want to know what you think. So an example that I don't support, but back in 2017, an op-ed actually inspired Trump to move on tax reform. So that's like a very concrete example of how it can make change. And it can be useful when you're trying to sway public opinion, dispel common misperceptions on an issue that's important to you. So I don't know about, like, a lot of you guys might not know how to really write one. You're like, well, where do I even start? So I tried to come up with a few key pointers on how to do it. And in the Times, they said what they're like looking for is just like the one unifying thing we're looking for is that all the pieces have an idea behind them, a point of view, and that they stimulate some kind of intellectual engagement with the audience. So basically, if it's something you care about and you argue it well, and like other people are interested, it has the opportunity to be published. So what I thought the first thing you should kind of start with is like your introduction, your hook. I feel like it's very like back to like high school, and it's kind of like a structured essay or something. But this is just a very like kind of like a template, and obviously like go where you would want with one. But it could be like say a hook is like Dara, you're a teacher, and like you're thinking about the future of your students and like the world they want to live in, or something like that. And then the next thing is you want to make an argument, and like it's very clear like what you're writing about. So you need to make your assertion and like why you're writing about it, why you're advocating for it. So one could be like, I'm arguing that LA needs to implement a better public transit system. The next step, I think, is just like simplicity, logic, clarity. Like it doesn't have to be like some scholar essay or something. It's very to the point about like what you're trying to say. And I would suggest like breaking up your supporting points into paragraphs and like having topic sentences to convey clearly and like repeat what you want to say. And then a lot of them are around 500 to like 800 words. So that's probably like when you double space it, like 2 pages or so. And then finally, I think it's important you could use context and evidence. So you could say how like historically, like we've been dealing with climate change for the past like 75 years, 100 years, and we've been ignoring it for so long. Or you could even use stats. I don't know what stat, but that's easy to look up. You could use some from the presentation about maybe like some percentage about like what percentage of communities of color are impacted by the climate gap. And then the next thing is, where do you send them? So you're basically sending them to local, online, or print publications. I think because we talked about California policies, it would probably be smart to stay in California. So like the LA Times is a big one. You could definitely do smaller. The East Bay Times is like up in the Bay Area. That's where I'm from. And so there's this website that I attached, if it loads. It's called everyone can see this, right? Okay, great. It's called the Op-Ed Project, and it actually includes all of these like prints. So here's one, the East Bay Times, and it tells you like what they look for. So you could either send in a letter or an op-ed, and it will tell you like how long they should be about and where you're sending them. So it's pretty, so you could either use this website when I send you guys the link after this, or it's really easy to look up the requirements or like criteria also. So I just included an example from the LA Times because I feel like a lot of people might send them there just because that's a really well-known one. But they ask for about 750 words or shorter. The submission must be sent to this email, and basically just your name, like a little mini bio, and like the title, and then you would paste in the text into the email. Okay, so before we do this, I'm gonna throw it off to Bill, and he can even share screen if he wants. But I will share this. Also, I know obviously this advocacy scale I think is a lot more involved than past ones. It might like take a little bit more time. So we are gonna like break for about like 20-25 minutes, but I don't expect it to be written in that amount of time. So what I think people could do is maybe just kind of write an outline of what they want to write about, like what they want to include. And then maybe like your homework would be to finish writing it. So with that being said, I'm going to throw it to Bill.
Sarah, that was a great presentation. Really, you've really captured it. So I'm just going to add a few things from my personal experience. I've actually been writing and publishing op-eds for over 30 years since I became an advocate. In fact, my first advocacy job, I think getting an op-ed published maybe was the first thing that made my boss tell me that I'd done something right. And that paper actually sent me a $100 check for writing the op-ed. So in those days, newspapers would actually pay you for doing this. Now I doubt that ever happens. The only thing I would just sort of amend from your presentation is, you said they are firsthand, written from your own experience. That's a great way to approach an op-ed, but it's not the only way. You could do something that's just based on analysis of a policy issue. So if you look at, the New York Times or the LA Times and look at their op-ed, they tend to have some regular op-ed writers, and then they have people that are contributors. And that'll give you a good sense of what kind of stuff is on an op-ed page. Here in Sacramento, since we're the state capital, we often get op-eds that are basically pitching a bill. So an advocate like me, might do an op-ed saying, well, here's a bill that they're going to vote on the legislature, and this is why it would help Californians. I was especially impressed that you had the history of how the op-ed was named that because it ran opposite the editorial page. I think if you open up a newspaper, and I realize people don't do that anymore, you read them online, but if you were to open up the actual paper, that is still true in something like the New York Times or the LA Times. they run their own editorials, which are not signed. And then opposite those, they run, often national and local columnists plus those from freelance contributors. Really agree with what you said about the lead sentence being important. In fact, I would suggest in your 20 minutes, work on the outline and see if you can just come up with the first sentence and try to have it be something that really grabs people. One thing to note about the headline, I usually, when I send in an op-ed, I put a headline on it, but you should be aware that in newspapers, the writers don't write the headlines, the editors do. So it's very likely that whatever you put as your headline will not be what it is when it appears in print. So, use that first sentence to really grab people. And then I just wanted to talk about, the how to. The op-ed space in the major papers, there's a lot of competition for that. So, if you can get into the LA Times, that's great, but they don't carry a lot of them. And so one of the things that we've often done is then we have a fallback. And there are a lot of publications, often online only publications, they're not as well known, so there's not as much competition. So you can go for those, and they can be local. Like, for example, there's an online publication called the Long Beach Post, which, because so much pollution comes from the port of Long Beach, we do a lot of work in Long Beach, and they tend to cover that reasonably well. And we found we can get an op-ed in the Long Beach Post. Now, some people will read that online, not that many. But then what you do is you then try to get more circulation for that. So you try to push your own op-ed. If there are, you post it on social media. If you have a website, you post it on your website. If you're on email listservs of people who, care about this, you send it out to the listserv. You send it to your elected officials. And we found that we can actually get a lot of traction by doing that. It's not so much that they're actually seeing the op-ed where it first appeared, but they're seeing it because we sent it to them. So I would really recommend doing that. And just like, you said an op-ed persuaded Trump to do something. Well, I don't believe Trump reads newspapers, so I don't think he saw it in the newspaper. I think, somebody showed it to him, right? So that's the key. You want to try to get it out there as much as possible. Another fallback option is if they won't print it as an op-ed, condense it into a shorter version and try to get it published as a letter to the editor. And again, there used to be, in print papers, they used to run a lot of letters. Now they don't run as many, but you find online, often there are a lot more letters running. And just like Sarah had great advice, look at the paper's rules for submitting an op-ed. They also will tell you their rules for submitting a letter. And it's usually got to be short, so you got to really know how to make your point. But that's another way. Once it's in print, you can send it around. And in the past, anyway, it's been said that people really do read the letters to the editor. So yeah, those are some of the means that I try to use to get a lot of circulation for op-eds.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that definitely, it's great to have some expert advice and tips on it. I just sent out the link, but I'll share my screen again. I totally agree with Bill about like right now it's just right, but send it to as many means as you can. So I think we're gonna break for about 20 to 25 minutes. So I'll probably bring back people around 12:35, between 12:40, and then we'll start sharing a little bit. So I'll share my screen again. Let's see. Desktop. Okay. I'll probably put it on the key pointers. I think that's the best. But yeah, I'm gonna mute myself and turn off my video during this, but please feel free to jump back in if you have questions. Don't just sit there stuck, because obviously we're here to help you. Okay. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat, so we'll see you guys soon. Okay. So that was about 22 minutes or so. So if you guys could wrap up where you are and bring it back. Great. Okay, how did it go for people? Okay. Kind of hard to get started sometimes. All right. So our final, we have to end at like 12:55 because there's another LA Works project that uses the same link. So we have about 17 minutes or so. So do people want to share like either their first sentence or I don't know, what they're kind of outline what they wanted to talk about, anything really.
I was kind of talking about how recently there's been a lot more fires that have been wrecking the state of California. So then how the emissions produced by transportation and industries has kind of helped contribute to that.
Very cool. I think you might have cut out a bit, but I think I got the gist. Did other people understand? No. Brian, could you repeat that if you don't mind?
Yeah, I kind of worded it weird, but basically, the kind of outline was how a lot of the fires right now that are increasing air pollution with everything have kind of been exaggerated by the climate change that we've caused through increased transportation and more private vehicles. Kind of an outline.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a great idea to start with something that's really at the top of people's minds to get their attention.
Yeah, I can go. Also, I actually was thinking about the fires too, since you can't really ignore them right now. You walk outside and notice it. But like I kind of tried to write a first sentence and I just said that I'm currently hiding inside from the smoky hair that is a result of the raging fires in Northern California. And these fires didn't just occur from dry weather, but from hundreds of lightning strikes during an eerie tropical storm, a direct result of extreme weather and climate change. And then I was thinking of going into maybe public transit, or we talked about like the selfishness of like people with the bike lanes and stuff like that. Does someone else want to go?
I just kind of want to add to the conversation of this fire real quick because like yesterday there were like 4 fires in the city of Los Angeles, just like really close to me. And they were mostly like houses and structures. So I wonder how that could also add to that conversation of fires and that.
Definitely.
Oh, yeah, I can go.
Go ahead.
So I wrote a title or a headline like, "Can it be easier being green?" I know that's a little, Dara called it pithy, but you know, I'm sure there's things out there like that. But my focus lately has been like, how can I, as a consumer and an individual person, kind of make a difference or feel like I'm making a difference? But it's really hard. I mean, you look around your house, your kitchen, your car, and you're like, how do I even start? So it's like, you know, we all turn a blind eye, we do grab and go coffee, and, you know, we're in the age of convenience and everything is at your fingertips and it's now. And then how we sort of slow down ourselves, like there's meditation movements and self-care, but like, what about earth care? Do you take the time to think like, is this decision, how does this affect the environment and the world? And then I didn't get to the end because it's kind of depressing up through then, but like sort of how maybe small changes over time can, you know, you sort of change your routine and see a difference over time, and getting people to just do that and recognize that your decisions can affect, you know, individual decisions can affect the world around you, and to be more mindful of that. I don't know.
I kind of went into the same vein. So we had, just a little background, last week we had a really long talk about composting, and Becca was feeling kind of down that day about the world, and I was, for whatever reason, very optimistic. And so we decided to start this Google Drive, and every month we're going to find a new sort of cause to really heavily promote and do research and write op-eds. We're so excited about this one today.
Yeah.
And so it was composting was ours for this month. And so that was kind of our idea, is that, you know, it feels so overwhelming, and we want to help so much. And with everything going on in the world, the election, the social justice movements, the COVID crisis, it's just, there's so much that everyone feels almost so overwhelmed to the point of shutting down and turning very cynical. So that's kind of the background of where this is coming from. But so for mine, my sort of intro hook, I went in a little different vein, but, you know, we all want to work smarter, not harder. So imagine if there were a way to make a huge impact with small steps, because so many of us feel like, and it's because the problems are so immense and so big that we feel like we have to take these huge steps to fix them. And of course that is necessary at a certain point, but and like I said, if everybody does a little bit, we can start to make bigger steps. So trying to hook in people who do want to help, but are so overwhelmed by the arduous task of it, and making it more simple, and taking simple steps, right? Like writing a letter is awesome for people like us who are a part of advocacy groups, but I'm thinking of my students. They're bombed with hours of homework. They're not going to take an extra hour and a half to write a letter, but they can start composting, and we can make buckets together. Like I want to do with my elementary school kids, where we make a bucket for them to compost. And that little step, even though it's, I know, not huge in the long run, is going to inspire. Oh, it's like when you lose 5 pounds, you're like, I'm going to keep going. And so that's sort of my hope. And my outline of that is on the effects of small changes and how little steps can make a big step. And in training kids like that at a younger age to maybe grow up to do that, you know?
So that's, and bring it back to their parents.
Because
if kids are guilting their parents, you know, here's this bucket, we have to use this. My teacher said, yeah.
So that, I know we kind of deviated away from the main day today, but that was kind of our idea.
Oh, thanks for sharing. I think that's really, really awesome. Does anyone want to like comment on their idea or anything?
I love it.
There you go. Does someone else want to share?
I can share. Yeah, and I apologize because I think I had taken a break when you told us to start working on an op-ed, so I didn't do that. But
oh, that's okay.
I do think that, you know, small steps are important, but you know, this change has to happen really fast, and the only way we're really going to get there is if we work with our elected officials, our government, local, national level. And so, you know, like what I could do, like you mentioned, Paul Koretz, I live in his zone, in his area, I could contact him. I just need somebody to tell me what to do. And I think that's the same with college students. If somebody would just tell them, do this, you know, and here's the letter already written, just click this link, you know, I think those are going to be the most effective things. I don't know how to help with that.
I know for me, I was trying to think, I was like, what am I going to talk about? And I don't drive. And so for me, getting around Los Angeles, right now, I haven't gotten on the bus either because I'm like, I don't know about that COVID situation. But getting around Los Angeles, if I had like a bike path that I knew that was safe to use, the thing is they're all disconnected and disjointed. So I'm just like, maybe that's why I'm like, maybe I need to do some research as into maybe somewhere there is, I mean, I'm sure there are bike paths here, but they're not connected. So finding like where they are and all that, and I guess researching like if somebody could put that research out there, because I understand that I think at least with LA that if they do work on a street, they have to make room for a protected bike lane and do that. But then you'll be like, ah, yes, this is great along Fairfax or something, and you're like, there is no bike lane anymore. Okay, so I'm just like, well, maybe I can go do something on that. That's about as far as I got thinking on that.
Alana.
I can go next. Similar to Alana, I was like, what do I even write about? Because like I'm not originally from here. I'm from actually Indiana, and just moved here recently. So I'm like still kind of learning everything that's kind of going on in regard to climate change here. And so I was just like kind of doing research on like some of the governor's budget proposals for, like in relation to climate change. Like what would I even like write about that is currently being done, you know, kind of thing. So just like educating myself.
Yeah, totally. I actually asked a question in the chat like during our little break about that, because I thought that was also something that we would talk about today, in regards to like what's currently being voted on in legislation, or like even what the Coalition for Clean Air is working on right now.
Well, I'd be happy to answer that.
Thanks.
It's interesting, in California, we have given the Air Resources Board a lot of authority to reduce emissions. So what I've found, and I've worked a lot on legislation over the years, but more and more I work on the regulations that the Air Board passes to implement laws that have already been enacted. And so this coming Thursday, they'll be voting on measures to reduce emissions from trucks and from ships when they're docked at ports like the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So that's a huge priority for me. I mentioned the clean cars. They're working on this next round of emission standards for after 2025 that'll affect all new cars sold in the state of California. And they're expected to adopt that next year. So the work on that is starting. There's a workshop on September 16th, in fact. And also zero emission trucks, they're going to be doing a rule that requires, they did one that says the manufacturers have to make the trucks. So next they're going to be saying that those that have big fleets of trucks will have to buy certain percentages of zero emission trucks. So those are some of the big measures we have queued up at the Air Resources Board. In terms of legislation, we're actually now going into the last 9 days of this year's legislative session. And there are a couple bills that we're trying to get passed. One is AB 841, authored by Assemblymember Phil Ting from San Francisco. And it would take some funds that have already been authorized and put them into three main purposes. One is to speed up the installation of charging infrastructure for electric cars and trucks. And the others are to help our schools be more healthy by, first of all, improving the ventilation at the schools. And I understand there's at least one teacher here. So, you know, we know that having healthy air is important for students in all times, and especially with COVID around. So this, and it would focus especially on schools in low income areas and would improve the ventilation there, which also will save on the energy bills. So the schools have more money for other things. And then secondly, to clean up the plumbing so there's not lead in the water at the schools. So that's AB 841. And then AB 326, which is authored by Assemblymember Al Muratsuchi, who's from the Torrance area. And he's one of the better Assembly members on the environment. He's taken on the oil industry. Unfortunately, didn't get that passed this year because the oil industry was so strong. But he has a bill that would help. I mean, it's sort of one particular niche, but it would make it easier for people to drive electric vehicles because they wouldn't have to buy them. They could subscribe on a monthly basis as members. And so they wouldn't have a big upfront cost. And you could just do it for a month. And if you don't like it, you could cancel. And so it's an opportunity at fairly low cost for people to have access to electric vehicles. So that's AB 326 by Muratsuchi. Because they're assembly bills, what that means is these bills are now in the Senate. So we need to get them passed by the state Senate. Then they would go back to the assembly and have to be passed there. If they make it there, then they would go to the governor and we'd be asking him to sign them. And then in terms of the budget, somebody brought up the budget. So I did want to say that one of the big problems we've had with Governor Newsom is that he has not prioritized clean transportation funding when it comes to the budget. So, you know, in the fall, he'll be working on his budget proposal for next year. And so we're trying to really get the message across to him that he needs to devote some resources to cleaning up the transportation system.
Awesome. Well, I feel like there's no more questions. That's a great note to end on since we're basically out of time. I just want to thank everyone for coming on a Saturday. Bill for like speaking. It was super, I think we all found it really interesting, and just thanks everyone for like being so eager and participating so much. So like we try to like assign homework kind of, but like it would be to like work on this op-ed or letter or whatever and like send it to whoever you think, whether it's a print of the listserv, a letter to the editor, whatever. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you, everyone. Okay, and our next session is in 2 weeks from today. All right, and we have 2 left.
Yeah,
all right, I hope to see you. Yeah.
The next one's on 9/5, and we'll be talking about